The pounding on my gate started just after sunrise, the kind of sharp, impatient knocking that tells you the person on the other side already believes they own whatever they're standing in front of. I stepped out onto the porch and saw 3 HOA board members waiting by the fence like a small committee of judges. In the center stood Darlene Whitmore, the board leader of Oakridge Valley Estates, holding a thick stack of violation papers against her chest like it was a badge of authority. Behind them, half the cul-de-sac had gathered along the roadside. People stood with coffee mugs and folded arms, watching like they'd shown up for a neighborhood show. Darlene didn't bother with greetings. She lifted one manicured finger and pointed directly at the windmill rising above my pasture. "That thing is coming down," she announced so everyone could hear. 30 days. After that, the fines begin. $500 a day. I glanced past her toward the houses scattered along the hill behind the trees. 10 homes. Perfect lawns, fresh paint. Sprinklers ticking quietly across green grass in the early sun. All of them connected to the same underground water line. A line powered by the windmill she was demanding I destroy. I could have explained it right there. Could have saved them the trouble. Instead, I gave a slow nod. "If the HOA wants the windmill gone," I said calmly, "then I'll remove it." A few people in the crowd murmured approval. Someone even chuckled. Darlene smiled like the victory was already hers. What none of them understood was simple. The moment that windmill stopped turning, every faucet on their street would run dry. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Ethan Caldwell, and the 5 acres behind that gate have been in my family longer than most of the houses in Oakridge Valley Estates have even existed. Long before the paved roads, long before the rows of identical mailboxes and trimmed hedges, my grandfather stood on that same patch of land and built something meant to last. Sergeant William Caldwell was an Army engineer back when the Army still expected men to build things with their hands and make them survive whatever nature threw at them. When he came home after the war, he bought this land for almost nothing. Back then, it was just open pasture, a few scattered oaks, and a shallow water table beneath the soil. In 1952, he built the windmill. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't meant to look pretty on postcards or satisfy someone's landscaping rules. It was built to do one simple job: pull water from the well deep beneath the pasture and keep the land alive. The steel tower stood tall enough to catch the prairie winds, and every turn of those blades drove a mechanical pump buried underground. Simple engineering. No electricity, no city connection. Just wind, steel, and water. The system worked so well that when developers started buying land nearby decades later, they ran into a problem. The ground on the ridge above my property didn't have reliable groundwater. Wells drilled there kept running dry. The developer who wanted to build Oakridge Valley Estates needed a solution before the county would approve construction, so he came knocking on my grandfather's door. The deal they made was simple and written into county records. The 10 houses built along the ridge could connect to the Caldwell well system. In exchange, my grandfather's property would remain completely independent. No HOA authority. No neighborhood restrictions. The windmill and well remained ours. The subdivision was built. Pipes were laid underground. The cul-de-sac got its water. And for decades, the arrangement worked quietly in the background. Most of the people living there now had no idea where their water actually came from. The system had just always worked, and people tend not to question things that work. By the time I returned home, my grandfather had been gone nearly a decade. I had spent most of my adult life with the Army Corps of Engineers, designing infrastructure and repairing things most people never noticed until they failed. Bridges, flood barriers, water systems. Practical work that required patience and planning. Retirement felt strange at first. The quiet was different from the constant motion of military life. But coming back to the Caldwell land helped. The house was older but sturdy. The pasture still stretched wide and open behind it, and the windmill still turned slowly in the breeze, exactly the way my grandfather built it. I repaired a few parts, cleaned the pump system, and the well worked like it always had. Most mornings were simple. Coffee on the porch. the sound of wind moving through the blades above the pasture. Occasionally the distant hum of sprinklers from the homes up the hill. Those houses looked like something from a brochure. Identical roofs, carefully trimmed lawns, bright mailboxes lined along the curb like soldiers in formation. At first, the neighbors were friendly enough. A few of them came by to introduce themselves when they noticed someone had finally moved back into the old Caldwell place. That's how I met Caleb Hartley. Caleb lived 2 houses down the ridge. Former Marine gunnery sergeant, retired a few years before me. You could tell within 10 seconds of shaking his hand that he'd spent most of his life working hard and solving problems instead of complaining about them. He walked out to the pasture one afternoon while I was checking the Windmill drive shaft. "That thing still running the well?" he asked, looking up at the spinning blades. "Every day," I said. He gave a low whistle. "That means half this street depends on it. Pretty much the whole cul-de-sac." Caleb nodded slowly, clearly doing the same math I had done years earlier. Most of the other neighbors never paid attention to it. The windmill was just part of the scenery to them. An old farm relic sitting behind a fence. The only person who seemed bothered by it was the one person who believed she controlled everything in the neighborhood. Darlene Whitmore. She had moved into Oakridge Valley Estates about 3 years before I came back. Within a year, she had worked her way onto the HOA board, and shortly after that, she became the board leader. Darlene liked rules. More specifically, she liked reminding people that she was the one enforcing them. You could see the pattern almost immediately. Emails about lawn height, complaints about mailbox colors. Formal warnings for things most people would barely notice. The kind of leadership built entirely on control. At first, she ignored my property. Probably because it sat outside the neighborhood fence line and didn't technically fall under HOA authority. The Caldwell land had always been separate, but the windmill was tall. Tall enough that you could see it clearly from every backyard in the cul-de-sac, and eventually that seemed to bother her. The first time she mentioned it was during a neighborhood gathering near the mailboxes. She stood with a few HOA supporters, looking toward my pasture. "That windmill really doesn't match the aesthetic of Oakridge Valley Estates," she said loudly enough for several people to hear. I didn't say anything. Neither did Caleb, but he glanced at me with a small smile that suggested he already understood where this was going. About a week later, the letter arrived. Official HOA letterhead. Formal language. A violation notice stating that the windmill on my property was considered a visual nuisance and needed to be removed within 30 days to maintain neighborhood aesthetic standards. $500 per day in fines if I failed to comply. I read the letter twice. Then I leaned back in the porch chair and looked out across the pasture at the windmill turning steadily in the wind. Up on the ridge, sprinklers were already ticking across bright green lawns. The HOA meeting was held in the Oakridge Valley Clubhouse, a neat brick building at the entrance of the subdivision that looked more like a small bank than a community center. I almost didn't go. In my experience, meetings like that rarely solved anything, but ignoring the letter entirely would only give Darlene Whitmore more ammunition, and I figured it was better to hear exactly what she thought she was enforcing. By the time I walked in, most of the folding chairs were already filled. Neighbors sat in small clusters, some whispering quietly while others scrolled on their phones. At the front of the room, the HOA board had arranged a long table like a panel of judges. Darlene sat in the center. She looked perfectly composed, wearing a navy blazer and holding a binder thick enough to suggest she had been preparing for this moment. On either side of her sat 2 of her most loyal supporters on the board, Brenda Collins and Patricia Lane. Brenda was already frowning when I walked through the door. Patricia gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Caleb Hartley sat toward the back of the room and nodded once when he saw me enter. Darlene tapped a pen against the table to bring the room to order. "Thank you all for attending tonight's meeting," she began in a voice that sounded rehearsed. "We have a few community matters to address, including a property compliance issue that affects the visual harmony of Oakridge Valley Estates." She didn't bother pretending it wasn't about me. Her eyes moved directly to where I was sitting. "As many of you are aware," she continued, "there is an outdated windmill structure located on the Caldwell property just outside the neighborhood boundary." A few heads turned toward me. That structure, she said firmly, is visible from nearly every home in the cul-de-sac and significantly disrupts the aesthetic standards outlined in our HOA guidelines. Brenda nodded immediately. It looks like an abandoned farm, she added loudly. Patricia flipped through a printed packet and held up a photo. We've received multiple complaints, she said. Homeowners moved here for a clean, modern community. That thing looks like it belongs in a museum. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I stood up. Actually, I said calmly, that windmill is part of the original infrastructure for this area. Darlene's expression tightened slightly. It was built decades before the subdivision, I continued, and it powers the well system connected to the houses on the ridge. A small murmur moved through the room. But Darlene raised her hand immediately. Mr. Dylan. Mr. Caldwell, she interrupted, her voice sharp. This meeting is not about historical trivia. It's about compliance with HOA standards. The windmill is not decorative, I said. It serves a purpose, Brenda scoffed. A rusty windmill spinning in someone's backyard is not a necessity, Patricia added. If the houses need water, they can connect to the city system like everyone else. I noticed a few neighbors exchanging uncertain looks. One man near the middle raised his hand slowly. Wait, our houses are connected to a well? Darlene didn't even let him finish. The matter before the board is very simple, she announced, raising her voice so the room focused back on her. The Caldwell windmill violates our community appearance standards. She flipped open her binder and pulled out a printed document. The board has voted unanimously to issue a formal removal order. She slid the paper across the table toward me. 30 days to dismantle the structure. Her eyes locked on mine. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day, followed by legal enforcement. Brenda folded her arms, looking pleased. Patricia gave a slow nod like the decision had been inevitable. The room grew quiet. Some of the neighbors looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. HOA meetings had a way of making people silent. Nobody wanted to be the next target. Caleb leaned back in his chair and muttered just loud enough for me to hear. Unbelievable. Darlene stood up from the table, signaling that the matter was already decided. This board takes the integrity of Oakridge Valley Estates very seriously, she said. We cannot allow one outdated structure to drag down the value of this entire neighborhood. Her supporters clapped lightly. The meeting moved on to other topics, but I didn't stay to listen. I walked out into the parking lot and stood there for a moment under the streetlights, thinking. Caleb came outside a few minutes later. You tried to tell them, he said. Didn't matter. He shook his head slowly. They don't have a clue what that windmill does, do they? No, I said. And you're going to let them push this? I looked out toward the dark ridge where the houses stood above my pasture. I'm going to check something first. That night, I drove into town and stopped at the county records office the next morning when it opened. Old property agreements are rarely exciting to read, but they tell the truth when people forget it. It took about an hour of digging through archived documents before I found what I was looking for. The original development agreement from decades earlier, signed by the subdivision developer, signed by my grandfather. A legally binding easement granting the Oakridge Valley Cul-de-Sac access to the Caldwell well system. And right there in the language was the critical detail. The windmill powered the pumps supplying water to the connected homes. 10 houses. Every sprinkler. Every faucet. Every shower. All of it depended on the windmill spinning above my pasture. I leaned back in the chair and read the document again just to be sure. The HOA had no authority over my property, but their removal order didn't say anything about the well pump. Just the windmill structure. When I got back home, the windmill was turning slowly in the afternoon breeze, exactly the way it always had. Caleb was leaning against the fence waiting for me. Well? He asked. I handed him the printed easement. He read the first page, then looked up toward the tower. A slow grin spread across his face. Oh, he said quietly. Yeah, so what are you going to do? I folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. I'm not going to argue with them. Caleb raised an eyebrow. No? No? I looked out across the pasture toward the houses on the ridge. I'm going to do exactly what they ordered. And this time, when Caleb looked back up at the windmill, his grin got even wider. Over the next few days, the quiet life I'd grown used to on the Caldwell land started to change. The letter from the HOA meeting wasn't the end of it. If anything, it seemed to encourage Darlene Whitmore to push harder. Every morning, another notice appeared in my mailbox. Sometimes it was a printed warning about the windmill. Sometimes it was a reminder of the 30-day deadline. Once it was a visual compliance report, complete with photographs taken from different angles of the cul-de-sac showing the tower rising above the trees. They treated it like evidence of a crime. I began seeing unfamiliar cars slowly driving past my gate during the afternoons. People would slow down just enough to glance toward the pasture before continuing along the road. The windmill had apparently become the most interesting thing in the neighborhood. Then the online posts started. Oakridge Valley Estates had a community social page where residents usually shared harmless things like lost pets or lawn care tips. Darlene turned it into something else entirely. One evening, Caleb texted me a screenshot. Darlene had posted a picture taken from someone's backyard. The windmill stood in the background above the fence line. Her caption read, "This outdated structure continues to violate community standards. The HOA will ensure compliance soon." The comments filled quickly. Brenda Collins wrote that it looked like an abandoned farm. Patricia Lane suggested that the structure was lowering property values for the entire street. A few other residents chimed in with polite complaints about how it didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic, but not everyone sounded comfortable with the conversation. Someone asked why the windmill had been there long before the subdivision existed. Another person asked if the structure actually served a purpose. Those questions didn't stay visible for long. Darlene deleted several of them within the hour. The next morning, I found another inspection notice taped to my gate. Apparently, the HOA had decided the windmill required daily monitoring until it was removed. I laughed when I read that. My land sat outside their boundary line. They had no legal authority to inspect anything, but Darlene clearly believed that writing it down made it real. A few neighbors eventually started coming to the fence to talk. Most of them looked uncomfortable standing there. One older couple from the end of the cul-de-sac stopped by one afternoon while I was repairing a section of pasture fencing. "We don't mean to bother you," the woman said carefully. "But is it true the HOA is making you tear that down?" "That's what the letter says." Her husband glanced up at the windmill turning slowly above us. "It's been there forever," he said. "My kids used to point at it when they were little." Another neighbor asked quietly whether I planned to fight the order. I just shrugged. "I'm thinking about it." Most of the conversations ended the same way. People walked back toward the neighborhood looking uneasy but not quite willing to challenge the HOA publicly. Caleb, on the other hand, wasn't the quiet type. One afternoon, he walked across the ridge and down the gravel path toward my fence with his phone in his hand. "You see this?" he asked, holding the screen out. Darlene had posted another picture online. This time, she stood in the foreground, pointing toward the windmill, like she was presenting some kind of victory speech. The caption read, 30 days and counting. Oakridge Valley deserves better. Caleb shook his head. "She's turning this into a public crusade, I noticed. You're awfully calm about it." I set the wrench down and walked over to the fence. "You want to see something?" We went inside the house and sat at the kitchen table while I pulled the envelope from the county records office out of the drawer. Inside were copies of the easement agreement. Caleb read the first page slowly. Then he read it again. By the time he finished the second page, his eyes had drifted toward the window where the windmill tower was visible above the pasture. He leaned back in the chair and let out a low whistle. "So every house up there," he said quietly, "connected to the Caldwell well. And the windmill runs the pump." "Exactly." Caleb laughed once, short and sharp. "You tried to tell them that at the meeting. They didn't want to hear it." He shook his head again, looking almost impressed now. "You're going to let them do this?" I folded the papers and slid them back into the envelope. "No." He watched me for a moment, waiting for the rest of the answer. "So what's the plan?" I walked to the window and looked out across the pasture. The windmill blades turned slowly in the afternoon wind, steady and quiet, just like they had for decades. "They ordered the windmill removed," I said. "Yeah, I'm going to remove it," Caleb frowned. You're serious? Completely. But when that thing stops, he didn't finish the sentence. We both knew what happened next. The sprinklers would stop. The faucets would run dry. Every house in the cul-de-sac would suddenly realize exactly where their water had been coming from. Caleb stared at the windmill again and slowly began to grin. Oh man. They wanted compliance, I said calmly. They're about to get it. The next morning I sat down at the desk and wrote a short letter to the Oakridge Valley HOA board. I kept the wording simple and precise. I acknowledged their violation notice. I confirmed that I would comply with their directive to remove the windmill structure from my property within the required time frame. No arguments, no objections. Just compliance. I mailed the letter that afternoon. By the time Darlene Whitmore read it, she would think she had already won. And that was exactly what I wanted her to believe. The moment my compliance letter reached the HOA board, the tone of the entire neighborhood changed. Darlene Whitmore wasted no time announcing her victory. That evening, the Oakridge Valley community page lit up with a long post written in the kind of triumphant tone people use when they believe they've successfully forced someone into submission. Great news for Oakridge Valley residents, she wrote. The outdated windmill structure on the Caldwell property will be removed in accordance with HOA aesthetic standards. Below the message, she added another line that made me shake my head when Caleb showed it to me later. To celebrate the improvement of our community, we will be gathering this Saturday morning to watch the removal. It was written like an event announcement. Bring coffee, bring neighbors. Come witness progress. Within an hour, the comments began pouring in. Brenda Collins posted 3 clapping emojis and wrote that it was about time the neighborhood looked modern again. Patricia Lane said she would bring pastries so everyone could enjoy the moment. A few residents even joked about taking photos of the windmill coming down like it was some kind of historical demolition. The entire thread filled with excitement. Caleb scrolled through it on his phone while sitting on my porch. They're throwing a party, he said, shaking his head. Looks that way. He leaned back in the chair and laughed quietly. You know they have absolutely no idea what they're celebrating. Not yet. While the neighborhood congratulated itself online, I spent the next morning driving into town. Daniel Pierce had an office on the second floor of an old brick building near the courthouse. We had known each other for years. Back when I was still working with the Army Corps, Daniel had been a JAG officer handling legal cases involving military infrastructure contracts. After leaving the service, he opened a private practice and quickly built a reputation for understanding property law better than most county attorneys. When I walked into his office and placed the HOA removal order and the easement documents on his desk, he read them slowly. Then he read them again. After about 10 minutes, he leaned back in his chair and smiled the same way Caleb had. This is real? He asked. County records. He tapped the HOA letter with his finger. They're demanding the windmill structure be removed. That's what it says. But nothing in here requires you to reconnect or replace the pumping system. Nope. Daniel folded his hands together and thought about it for a moment. So legally speaking, he said, if you comply with their order exactly as written, he didn't finish the sentence. We stop pumping water, I said. He nodded slowly. Which means the cul-de-sac loses its supply. Correct. Daniel stared at the documents for a few seconds before letting out a low chuckle. They've essentially ordered their own water shutoff. That's what it looks like. He pushed the papers back toward me. You're within your rights to comply with their demand. As long as you follow the wording exactly, there's no legal problem on your end. And the easement? The easement guarantees them access to water from your well system, he said. But if they order you to dismantle the mechanism that powers the system, that's on them. He leaned forward slightly. I assume you're not planning to warn them. No. Daniel nodded again. In that case, he said, make sure everything is documented. That was the part I was already working on. Over the next few days, I began making calls. The windmill wasn't something you removed with a ladder and a wrench. The tower stood tall enough that it required professional equipment to dismantle safely. That's where Liam and Owen Carter came in. The Carter brothers ran a small construction company outside town. They had cranes, heavy equipment, and the kind of experience that comes from years of tearing down old farm structures without damaging the surrounding land. When they arrived at the property to inspect the windmill, Liam walked slowly around the tower looking up at the spinning blades. "You sure you want this taken down?" he asked. "HOA order." He shrugged. "Your property." We scheduled the removal for the following Saturday morning. Exactly the same day Darlene Whitmore had invited the neighborhood to gather and watch. Meanwhile, I quietly spoke to a few people I trusted. Caleb, obviously, the older couple from the end of the cul-de-sac, and one other neighbor who had privately asked questions about the well system. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. "Saturday might get interesting," I said. Most of them looked confused. Caleb did not. The night before the removal, he came over and stood with me by the fence watching the windmill turning slowly in the fading evening light. The blades creaked softly with each rotation. That sound had been part of the land for more than 70 years. "You sure about this?" Caleb asked. "Absolutely." He crossed his arms and stared up at the tower. "You realize half the neighborhood is going to be standing here tomorrow." "I know. And the moment that thing stops..." Again, he left the sentence unfinished. I looked out toward the ridge where the houses sat quietly under the darkening sky. 10 homes, 10 water lines, all depending on the same pump buried beneath the pasture. Caleb finally turned toward me. "What happens when that windmill stops?" I watched the blades spin once more in the wind before answering. "They learn why my grandfather built it." Saturday morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of calm weather that made the windmill turn steadily against a deep blue sky. I woke up early, made coffee, and stepped out onto the porch long before anyone else appeared. The pasture was quiet except for the slow creak of the blades turning above the tower. For a moment it felt like any other morning on the Caldwell land. Then the first car pulled up near the gate. By 8:30, the roadside along the fence was filling with vehicles. People stepped out carrying travel mugs, folding chairs, even a couple of cameras. Word had clearly spread through the neighborhood. Darlene Whitmore arrived shortly after 9 in a white SUV, stepping out dressed like she was attending some kind of ribbon-cutting ceremony. Behind her came Brenda Collins and Patricia Lane, both carrying boxes of donuts from the bakery in town. They set up a small folding table near the road, like hosts welcoming guests to an event. "Coffee?" Brenda asked cheerfully to anyone walking up. Patricia laughed as she handed out napkins. "Front row seats today." From where I stood inside the fence, I could hear the chatter drifting across the pasture. People were talking about how strange the windmill looked, about how much nicer the neighborhood would be once it was gone. Some joked about finally having a clear skyline above the houses. Several residents held up their phones, already recording. Caleb walked up beside me just before 9:30 and leaned against the fence. "Well," he said quietly, looking at the crowd gathering along the road, "this turned into a festival. Looks like it." He watched Darlene for a moment as she moved through the crowd, shaking hands and pointing toward the tower. She really believes she won this. I took a slow sip of coffee. "She'll figure it out soon enough." A low rumble echoed across the road as a large crane truck turned into the gravel entrance and rolled toward the pasture gate. The Carter brothers had arrived. Liam stepped out of the driver's seat and gave a quick wave. "You ready?" he asked. "Go ahead." The crane unfolded slowly, metal arms extending high above the grass as Owen began positioning stabilizers on the ground. The machine towered nearly as tall as the windmill itself. The crowd grew quieter as the equipment started moving. Several residents stepped closer to the fence line, phones raised higher now. Darlene stood near the front of the group with a wide smile. "Finally," I heard her say. Liam and Owen walked across the pasture carrying their tools and began climbing the windmill tower with the steady confidence of people who had done this work 100 times before. Every movement seemed to draw more attention from the crowd. The Carter brothers secured themselves near the top platform, while another worker began inspecting the drive assembly that connected the spinning blades to the pump shaft below. Caleb folded his arms beside me. "You'd think they were watching fireworks," he muttered. Across the field, Daniel Pierce stood quietly near the fence line with a leather folder tucked under his arm. He had arrived earlier without drawing attention and positioned himself where he could see everything clearly. He looked completely calm. The wind continued pushing the blades in a slow, steady rotation while the contractors prepared the disconnection. One of them shouted something down to Liam, who nodded and began loosening the metal coupling that linked the windmill drive shaft to the well pump mechanism buried beneath the tower. The process took time. Bolts loosened. Wrenches turned. Metal clanked softly against metal. The crowd watched every movement. Some people whispered to each other. Others focused their phone cameras on the workers high above the pasture. Darlene checked her watch more than once, clearly impatient for the moment the tower would come down. But the tower itself wasn't the important part. What mattered was the mechanism turning inside it. The mechanical linkage that transferred the windmill's rotation into the pump system underground. Without that connection, the well wouldn't move a single drop of water. I could feel the quiet tension building in the air. Caleb shifted his weight slightly. "You ever notice," he said under his breath, "how people love watching something get torn down? Especially when they think it doesn't affect them." Across the pasture, Liam raised his hand and called down to Owen. "Drive shaft's almost loose." The blades above them turned once more in the wind. Then again, slow, steady. Every house along the ridge still had running water. For the moment, Daniel glanced at his watch. The contractors finished removing the final bolts holding the drive mechanism in place. Liam looked down from the tower toward me. "Ready?" I nodded once. He pulled the metal coupling free. The connection snapped loose with a sharp clank that echoed faintly across the field. For a second, nothing seemed different. The blades still moved in the wind, but now they spun freely, no longer connected to the pump below. Caleb looked at his watch. 10 o'clock, he said quietly. Above us, the windmill blades turned once more. Then slowly, the pumping mechanism below fell silent. At exactly 10 o'clock, the windmill stopped turning. For a few seconds after the mechanism disconnected, nothing seemed different. The wind still moved across the pasture. The blades at the top of the tower turned lazily, spinning freely now without resistance. To anyone standing along the fence, it probably looked like the job was still in progress. Darlene Whitmore clapped her hands once and turned toward the small crowd gathered near the roadside. "Well," she announced proudly, "there it is." Compliance. Several people laughed and lifted their phones higher to capture the moment. Brenda Collins began passing out another round of coffee cups while Patricia Lane joked about finally having a clean skyline behind the houses. From where I stood, I could see the ridge clearly. 10 homes sat quietly in the morning sun. Perfect lawn stretched behind them, bright green from the sprinklers that usually ran every Saturday morning. Except now, those sprinklers weren't moving. At first, no one noticed. The crowd's attention stayed fixed on the crane and the workers climbing down from the windmill tower. The Carter brothers began packing tools while Liam shouted instructions to Owen about securing the equipment. A minute passed. Then another. Across the ridge, one of the sprinklers near the Walters house sputtered. The steady ticking rhythm stopped. Water pressure dropped suddenly, and the spray collapsed into a weak stream before disappearing completely. A few seconds later, the same thing happened at the next house. Then another. From where we stood, you could almost watch the change spread down the line of yards like someone flipping off switches one by one. Caleb noticed first. He nudged my arm slightly and tilted his head toward the ridge. "Here we go," he muttered. Up on the street, one of the homeowners stepped out into his backyard holding a garden hose. He twisted the nozzle and frowned. Nothing came out. He tried again, shaking the hose like that might somehow fix the problem. Still nothing. A woman from the next house stepped onto her porch and looked down at the sprinkler head sitting motionless in the grass. Within another minute, several more people had come outside. Confusion spread quickly. From the pasture, we could hear faint voices drifting down the hill. "What happened to the water? Did someone turn off the system? My hose isn't working." The crowd near the fence hadn't noticed yet. They were still focused on the windmill tower, while Liam and Owen finished securing the crane cables. Darlene stood near the front of the group smiling, clearly enjoying the attention. But then a man appeared at the top of the ridge road running toward the gathering. Greg Walters. He ran down the street waving his arms like something was on fire. "My water's gone," he shouted before he even reached the crowd. "The faucets aren't working," Several people turned toward him in surprise. "What do you mean gone?" Brenda asked. "Nothing's coming out," Greg said, breathing hard. "Kitchen sink, bathroom, everything's dry." Patricia frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." Someone else laughed nervously. "Maybe the city's doing maintenance or something." Darlene waved a dismissive hand. "It's probably just a temporary pressure issue," she said confidently. "Coincidences happen." But while she was speaking, another neighbor hurried down the road. Then another. Within moments, 3 different homeowners were standing near the fence, all talking at once. My sprinkler stopped. "Our shower won't turn on. There's no water in the kitchen." The murmurs in the crowd began to grow louder. Phones that had been pointed toward the windmill slowly lowered as people turned toward the ridge where their houses sat. A woman pulled out her phone and dialed someone. "What do you mean it's not working?" she asked into the receiver. "Check the bathroom sink." Pause. Then her eyes widened. "You're kidding." More residents started calling their families inside the houses. The answers were all the same. No water. Not in the sinks. Not in the showers. Not even a drip. Greg Walters wiped sweat from his forehead and looked around the group in disbelief. "It just stopped," he said. 1 second everything was fine, and then nothing. Darlene's confident expression started to fade. She crossed her arms and glanced toward the windmill tower, then back toward the ridge. "That can't possibly be related," she said sharply. "This neighborhood uses a municipal system." Several people exchanged uncertain looks. "Are you sure?" someone asked quietly. Greg shook his head. "I just checked every faucet in my house." Another homeowner held up her phone. "My husband says the same thing." The murmuring grew louder, turning into anxious conversation. People were no longer looking at the crane or the contractors. Now they were looking at the ridge. At their houses. At the dry sprinkler heads and silent hoses. And then slowly, almost all at once, the realization began creeping across the crowd. 10 homes. 10 water lines, all failing at the exact same moment. A few heads started turning, first toward the windmill, then toward the pasture, finally toward me. Caleb noticed it too and leaned slightly closer. "Well," he said quietly, "this is the part where they start doing the math." One by one, the conversations died down. The crowd grew quiet, and before long, every single person standing along that fence line was staring directly at me. For several seconds, no one spoke. The entire crowd stood frozen along the fence line, looking between the silent windmill, the houses on the ridge, and me. Confusion slowly shifted into realization. Greg Walters was the first to break the silence. "You," he said, pointing toward the tower behind me. "Did you shut off the water?" His voice wasn't angry yet. Just stunned. I stepped closer to the fence so everyone could hear me clearly. "I removed the windmill," I said calmly. Darlene Whitmore immediately shook her head. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "This neighborhood uses a municipal supply. That old farm tower has nothing to do with it." A few people looked at her uncertainly. Greg wasn't convinced. "My kitchen faucet just stopped working the second that thing came apart," he shouted. Another homeowner stepped forward. "Same here. My sprinklers died too. My bathroom sink is completely dry." The noise grew louder as more residents spoke up at once. Darlene lifted her hands as if trying to regain control of the moment. "Everyone calm down," she said firmly. "This is clearly some kind of temporary pressure issue." I shook my head slowly. "It's not pressure." The murmuring stopped again. "The windmill powered the well pump," I said. A few people blinked in confusion. "What well pump?" someone asked. "The one that supplies water to the cul-de-sac?" Several residents stared at me like they weren't sure they heard correctly. Greg turned toward the ridge and then back toward the pasture. "You're saying our houses were using that well?" "Yes." "And the windmill ran it?" "Yes." The quiet that followed was heavier than before. Darlene stepped forward quickly. "That is absolutely not true," she said sharply. "You're just trying to cause panic because the HOA enforced compliance." But before she could continue, Daniel Pierce stepped up beside the fence. He opened the leather folder he'd been carrying and pulled out several printed documents. "These are county property records," he said calmly, handing the first page to Greg. Greg read the heading and frowned. What is this? Original development easement, Daniel explained. Signed when Oakridge Valley Estates was built. More residents stepped closer to see the papers. The documents passed from one hand to another while Daniel spoke clearly so everyone could hear. The developer who built this subdivision couldn't find a reliable water source on the ridge, he said. So he negotiated access to the Caldwell well system on Mr. W&I, Caldwell's property. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. That agreement allowed 10 homes in the cul-de-sac to connect to the well. Greg flipped through the pages quickly. And the windmill powered the pump, Daniel said. Now the realization hit the entire group at once. Several homeowners turned toward the ridge where their houses sat silent and dry. A woman near the back whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." Darlene's voice rose sharply again. "This is completely irrelevant," she snapped. "The HOA has every right to enforce appearance standards in this neighborhood." Daniel calmly held up another document. "The HOA also issued a written removal order," he said. He handed that paper to Greg as well. Greg scanned the page, then looked up slowly. The signature at the bottom was impossible to miss. Darlene Whitmore. "This says you demanded the windmill be removed," Greg said. "That structure violated community rules," Darlene replied defensively. "But the windmill ran the pump." Her voice grew louder. "That was never confirmed." I spoke quietly from the other side of the fence. "I tried to explain it at the meeting." Several heads in the crowd turned toward Darlene. Greg looked back down at the document in his hands. "You forced him to take it down." Brenda Collins suddenly stepped forward. "This is Ethan's fault," she said quickly. "He knew this would happen and he did it anyway." Patricia nodded beside her. "He shut off our water on purpose." But Daniel shook his head. "No," he said calmly. Mr. Caldwell complied with the HOA's written directive. He pointed to the document Greg was holding. "The board ordered removal of the windmill structure. That is exactly what happened this morning." A long silence followed. Then the shouting began. "What were you thinking?" someone yelled at Darlene. "You cut off the entire street. My kids can't even use the bathroom." Another homeowner stepped closer to the fence, clearly furious. "You never checked where our water came from." More voices joined in. "This is insane. How could the HOA not know this?" Greg held up the easement document again. "It's right here in the county records." Darlene's confidence had completely vanished. Her face had gone pale as she looked from one angry neighbor to another. "This situation will be resolved," she said weakly. But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. Neighbors who had supported her only minutes earlier were now demanding answers. Brenda and Patricia tried to calm people down, but no one paid attention to them. The mood of the entire gathering had flipped. The celebration had turned into outrage. And standing in the center of it all, Darlene Whitmore no longer looked like the leader of Oakridge Valley Estates. She looked like the person responsible for shutting off the entire neighborhood's water. For years, she had controlled every meeting, every rule, every complaint, but now the authority she relied on was crumbling right in front of everyone. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. By the time the crowd finally dispersed that morning, the mood in Oakridge Valley had completely changed. What started as a celebration ended in silence, frustration, and a lot of angry homeowners walking back up the hill to houses that suddenly had no running water. Within a few hours, the HOA board announced an emergency meeting. This time, the clubhouse filled faster than it ever had before. No coffee table. No pastries. No smiling speeches. Just a room full of homeowners who were very aware that their sinks, showers, and toilets had stopped working because of a decision the board had forced through. Darlene Whitmore tried to open the meeting with the same confident tone she always used. It didn't last long. The first homeowner stood up before she finished her sentence. "You shut off the entire street's water," he said flatly. Another resident raised the easement document Daniel had distributed that morning. "This agreement has been on file for decades," she said. "How did the board not know about it?" Brenda Collins tried to interrupt. Patricia Lane attempted to argue that the situation could be resolved quickly, but the room had already turned against them. One by one, the residents stood up and spoke. Some were angry. Others were simply stunned that something so important had been ignored for so long. By the time the votes were called, the outcome wasn't even close. Darlene Whitmore was removed as board leader. Brenda Collins and Patricia Lane stepped down shortly afterward. The entire HOA board was dissolved before the meeting even ended. For the first time since the subdivision had been built, Oakridge Valley Estates had no leadership at all. That problem solved itself quickly. Several residents suggested Caleb Hartley. He didn't volunteer, and he certainly didn't campaign for it, but most of the people in that room trusted him more than anyone else there. A retired Marine gunnery sergeant tends to carry a certain kind of credibility. By the end of the meeting, Caleb had been named interim board leader until a new HOA election could be organized. The next problem was harder. Without the windmill connected to the pump system, the cul-de-sac had no water supply. Someone suggested connecting the neighborhood to the municipal water system, but the estimates that came back from the county engineers made the room very quiet. Running a new line up the ridge would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It would take months. And every homeowner would be responsible for paying part of it, which meant there was really only one practical solution. They had to talk to me. A few days later, a small group of residents walked down the gravel path to my gate. Caleb was with them, along with several neighbors who had attended the emergency meeting. No one looked confrontational this time. They looked tired. Caleb rested his arms on the fence. "We need the pump running again," he said. I figured. One of the homeowners stepped forward. "We'd like to negotiate a new agreement," she said carefully. The discussion took most of the afternoon. In the end, the terms were simple. The windmill and well system would remain the property of the Caldwell land, exactly as my grandfather had designed it decades earlier. The cul-de-sac homes could continue using the water, but the new agreement formally recognized my ownership and control over the infrastructure. No HOA authority over the windmill. No aesthetic violations. No future removal orders. Once the paperwork was signed, the Carter brothers returned and reconnected the drive system to the pump. When the windmill blades started turning again, the water returned to the cul-de-sac just as quickly as it had disappeared. Sprinklers began ticking across lawns again. Kitchen faucets came back to life. Showers worked. Life returned to normal. Except the windmill wasn't treated like an eyesore anymore. People started pointing it out to visitors like it was part of the neighborhood's history. Kids rode their bikes past the ridge just to watch the blades turning above the pasture. It had become something else entirely. A reminder. Because sometimes people believe power means control. But real leadership is understanding what actually keeps a community alive. Sometimes the quiet old machine everyone wants to tear down is the only reason the whole neighborhood still works. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?